potential of Olympism, try saying that quickly, and the role of the Charter for women, I deal very, very broadly in the time available with discrimination and human rights issues that arise. I do have an interest in anything that seems to cause a disadvantage in sport for those with disabilities, children, women. I have a daughter, 9 years old, she's just about 9, and she has a disability. It's an invisible disability, she doesn't know she has it yet. And it's coming to that time where I'm going to have to explain to her what that means and some attitudinal barriers that she's going to face. I was discussing that with a fellow academic, but how I was going to do that. And the fellow academic suggested maybe I should at the same time explain to her she's a woman. The topic was Olympism and the Olympic Charter, the potential for women, because I think it is the Olympics and Olympism and the power that has great potential. In many cultures and in certain sectors and situations within others, the abilities of women are devalued. Women's rights are limited and they are treated less favourably than men. Sport is one sector in which that still occurs, surprisingly. Any society that violates the human rights of women is likely to do so where sport is concerned. Sport is also a sector in which great advances for the treatment and rights of women can be made both within the sports and as a catalyst to greater change. That was best articulated, I think, by Nawal El-Moutawakel, who was a 1984 Olympic gold medalist. Everyone familiar with her? She's an esteemed member of the IOC. She was one of the first Muslim women to compete at the Olympics. And as she said, sport is one of the best tools for social change because it is a large part of cultures around the world and reaches into every socio-economic class of society. If laws are put in place, the benefits will be beyond measure. Sport helps to develop self-esteem and confidence, improve physical and mental well-being, serve as a medium of communication and empower women to improve themselves and their communities. Using the example of the 2012 Women's Olympics and the issues surrounding Saudi Arabia, everyone familiar with what happened with Saudi Arabia? That's good because I'm going to be very interesting for you this afternoon then. I argue that the International Olympic Committee has not to date done enough for women. I argue that the IOC should lead by example in its own governance and practices and comply with its own charter, which it doesn't. The Olympic Charter reflects principles of human rights that relate to the treatment of women as are set out in the United Nations Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The Convention in turn supports Olympism values. Those values include gender equity. I argue that an event of the magnitude of the Olympic Games needs to deliver on that potential to influence change across the globe by way of example and direct action so as to maintain its credibility and influence, but more simply, because it can. I'll very broadly take you through the Olympism phenomenon, its power and its previous influences, with which you will hopefully be familiar. The Olympic Charter, its terminology regarding women and the specific intent that it has to influence. The opportunities for women at and in relation to the Olympic Games, and the fact that they fail to meet their own charter. The IOC's difficulty in dealing with the treatment of women, because it is difficult, it's a conundrum. Recommendations for how the IOC can comply with the charter regarding gender equity and the effect that it could have. I have heard doubts that there is such a thing as Olympism. Scholars seek to define it, and the IOC rely heavily on it. The only place it appears formally is in the Olympic Charter and only to describe the fundamental principles of Olympism. It is an ideological basis upon which the IOC founds the Olympic Games and the effect the Games can have. Olympism is the phenomenon that seeks to promote human dignity, equality and non-discrimination, ethics and life education through sport. It is created with the specific purpose of having great influence through and beyond sport. If I can ask you to consider Olympism as a circular phenomenon, this is its potential for impact. The Olympic Games is a mega event. It needs to maintain respectability and credibility. It needs to have a status so that there is a great desire to participate. You need people to want to go to this event, and that's people and countries as far as the Olympics is concerned. Once there's a great desire to participate, you then have the ability to make rules, and indeed you can require then strong compliance with those rules in order to come and participate because everybody wants a piece of it. And those rules then can go beyond just the event. The rules, the Olympic Charter, goes beyond just a sporting event. Once you have that, you have great influence great potential to influence those who want to participate. Then you have respectability and credibility, and the cycle continues. That, I argue, is the phenomenon of Olympism. I argue that the abilities that are provided by this phenomenon create responsibility to use that influence. Failure to adhere to the fundamental principles created in order to wield great influence theoretically should result in exclusion from the Games. The IOC has taken that action, as we know, in the past. South Africa was excluded from Tokyo in 1960, not included back in the Olympic Games until Barcelona in 1992, and only after a change in their political regime. Rhodesia was excluded in 1972 from the Munich Games. There was a threat to exclude the then Yugoslavia from the 1992 Barcelona Games in relation to their human rights regime. And we've seen it this year with Russia and the doping, that the IOC has put great pressure on the IAAF to exclude those athletes and the Athletics Federation from Russia in participating because of their doping regime. But when the IOC does all of those things, why is it that they can't take greater action in relation to women? Take, for example, Saudi Arabia. It was reported that the IOC forced Saudi Arabia to allow 2 expatriate women to compete at the 2012 Olympic Games, and that Saudi Arabia was reluctant to permit it. The women were required to have male chaperones, and they were required to wear appropriate clothing. In Saudi Arabia, women are not permitted to play sport. Girls are not permitted or provided with an opportunity to play sport at school, well, that's changing in some private schools in a very limited way. Women are not permitted to use the stadia or facilities to train. They're not permitted to be seen by men. Remember, this is a country where women aren't actually allowed to go to stadia to watch sport, let alone participate in it. Saudi Arabia has since then reportedly floated the idea of having a men's and women's Olympic held separately so that they wouldn't have to hold any of the women's events in their country. They didn't send any women to the 2014 Asian Games, notwithstanding reported pressure from the IOC, claiming that they didn't have women who were ready or who would have qualified for the Asian Games, and that they were training women to compete in equestrian, fencing, shooting and archery, as they were Olympic contests that were accepted culturally and religiously in Saudi Arabia. Now, the IOC could exclude Saudi Arabia from participating in the Games, but it does not. It manages the inclusion of women, and at times, in the example of 2012, that could be said to be token and with dubious outcomes. That inclusion of women from Saudi Arabia at the 2012 Games added fuel to the furor that this was the women's Games. It was claimed for the first time ever that at least one woman competed for every country that attended, and women competed in every sporting discipline. Those claims were technically incorrect. Barbados, Nauru and the Federation of St Kitts and Nevis didn't send any women. They had before. And it was all surrounding the introduction of boxing for women at the Olympics, even though it was introduced on a far more limited scale than for men. And it had taken more than 100 years for us to introduce it. And I argue that there's a level of discomfort with this celebration of the Women's Games. Firstly, that there were such small gains, and yet they were made so significant by the media. Secondly, some of these women and their fellow citizens live with discrimination and oppression on a daily basis. And thirdly, because discrimination against women continues in the Olympic movement and beyond. Women from Brunei, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran and Afghanistan all reportedly had great difficulties in attending and their participation at the Olympic Games in 2012. And that was reflective of the treatment that they endure in their countries. The attention drawn to these women by their attendances highlighted their lack of previous opportunity and experience. They are eligible to compete only by virtue of what is the universality rule. That is used by the IOC to permit athletes to enter the Olympics who would otherwise not qualify, to promote opportunity at the Games and in accordance with some of the fundamental principles. But their inclusion, I argue, masks the failure of the IOC to do more. And if you consider the qualitative data from the Olympic Games, at the Olympic Games in 2012, there were 136 women events and 166 men's events, providing 30 additional events with gold medals available to the men. Events such as wrestling, judo, boxing, canoeing, taekwondo, rowing, weightlifting, shooting, it goes on, diving, all provide men at times greater and offering differing opportunities to compete, greater and different weight categories or differing formats, in order to manage the gigantism of the Olympic Games and limit the numbers of people attending, it is the women's events that appear to suffer. The Winter Olympics and the Paralympics have similar issues. In Rio, it looks to be that the ratios for the opportunities are the same. The medals that are available for women are only 21 less than men on this occasion. But the differences that are just inexplicable in some sports, such as canoeing or rowing and shooting, the weight differences remaining in weightlifting, judo, wrestling and taekwondo, they all remain. These differences are often a result of an argument that the number of women available at the elite level is just too few to justify those events, or that women are not suited to a particular offering. When the differences are based on stamina and strength, they are not discriminatory. Some of the events for men, women do not wish to compete in, and vice versa. Some of the differences, however, are discriminatory, as is the lack of equal opportunities to win medals or to participate in the same way or at all in certain events. The statistics surrounding women's roles in non-athlete areas, of the various sports are alarmingly bleak. These reports were undertaken in 2004, 2010, 2013, and the statistics aren't changing. The IOC, the NOCs, the National Organising Committees, and the international federations all fail to comply with what are modest goals for the inclusion of women in the executive and decision-making roles that relate to the sports that are involved in the Olympics. The results were similar, and as at 2014, can be summarised in a few sentences. In both the NOCs and the international federations, there are approximately 70% or more that have less than 20% women in decision-making roles. On the IOC itself, only 20% of the members are women. This figure of 20% is telling, because targets for governance were set in 2000 for 20% of decision-making positions to be held by women in all executives in the Olympic movement by 2005. That was more than 10 years ago, and we haven't even reached 20% across the sports. We can't exceed 20% on the IOC, apparently. This lack of opportunity for women in sport participation and in appointments to governance, coaching and administration positions in the past has resulted in now having less experienced, less inclined and less qualified women available than should be, and far less than men. And this skews the possibility then of women achieving these positions. And really, even the setting of a target of 20% itself is a problem. There are other examples, of course, in Western cultures. Women in sport are devalued, particularly in sport. Everyone remember the issue in relation to the basketballers, and very recently we've had the letter from the Federal Minister saying that the national sports are required to have their women and men travel and stay in the same level of accommodation. Now, that goes for basketball, for women's football. There are problems in the attitude towards women in our cricket, even though we've made great grounds. Cricket is terrible. Women face great barriers with an attitudinal issue in our whole society that women's sport is devalued. And as one of my colleagues said, you only have to open the paper to realise that. You know, there's the old joke that animals feature more than women in the sporting pages. This general cultural attitude towards sport is reflected in very low sponsorship and very low broadcast rates. And it's not just Australia, the US and the UK have very similar problems. When these discriminatory attitudes prevail for women's sport in Western cultures, it's not surprising that progress for other cultures is so slow. It also demonstrates how far-reaching Olympism could be. Now, I apologise for this, but I needed to show you or provide you the opportunity to have a look at the parts of the Olympic Charter that clearly empower the IOC to take action specifically relating to women. And remember, this is a document that they create. Its evolution has reflected a significant movement by women to be involved, and it's changed over the years, particularly in relation to women because of that movement. These fundamental principles, and I've just extracted ones that you can see have some relevance to women, deal with the preservation of human dignity, ethical principles, the practice of sport being a human right, the freedoms set forth in the Olympic Charter being delivered without discrimination. All of these, even those in relation to education, all of these relate to the treatment of women. So there is the potential. The Charter goes on. The IOC's role, this specifically sets out what the IOC says it will do. It will act against discrimination affecting the Olympic movement and Very specifically and uniquely, it will encourage and support the promotion of women in sport at all levels and in all structures, with a view to implementing the principle of equality of men and women. Now, those principles have changed over the years, and that's an issue for another paper as to how the Charter reflects the changes in what the IOC has seen it's been able to do. But even within this Charter, the IOC still only set 20% targets for the inclusion of women in governance, and they've taken some time to set a target of 50% inclusion for participation at the Games, which has now, although not officially, but that's now being talked about. And it does pose the question, would such a tolerance be invoked where drugs in sport are concerned? Is only 20% of athletes taking drugs going to be acceptable? Now, this level of tolerance for the attitude is something that the IOC can turn around. It sets a poor example for all, and particularly our youth. When the Charter talks about education and the role of sport in education, and Jacques Rogue, president of the IOC in 2004, said, "The Olympic movement believes in the education role of sport. That is why it preaches the values of tolerance, fair play and respect for the rules. Sport has a duty to set an example. Let us respect and ensure respect to strict ethics and sanctioning athletes and leaders who do not do so." That was said in relation to drugs in sport and corruption in sport. It's equally as applicable, I argue, to the treatment of women. But as I've said, the IOC has great difficulty, it seems, in dealing with women. And there are reasons for that. Firstly, the Charter itself is a paradox, not only providing that they will act against discrimination, such as banning Saudi Arabia from coming to the Olympics, but that they will promote women. So how do you ban a country but try to get their women to come? Secondly, the IOC does not comply with the Charter in its own governance or conduct of the Olympic Games. And it's appeared to have found that difficult since Pierre de Coubertin first announced his preference that women should be good spectators in the early 1900s. Thirdly, there are Western cultures that struggle with discrimination against women in sport and society, and to exclude them might exclude a fair number of countries from the Olympics. And lastly, the attitudes in Muslim countries are steeped in culture, religion and tradition, opposed to Western values, and a change in those values simply can't be imposed. There's good news, some good news. It is anticipated that Olympic Agenda 2020 will provide some solutions. Anyone know what the Agenda 2020 is? Familiar with that? Some nodding. So this came out of the 127th IOC session in December 2014. And it is seen to be quite revolutionary. There's been some significant recommendations made for how they're going to reformat and reform the Olympics. It's been referred to as individual pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And the recommendations are said to have the potential to manage the size of the Olympic Games, which is a real problem, balanced with the sports and the events. And if you look really hard, you find some relating to women. Recommendation 10 is a move from a sport-based event to an event-based program. So that gives us the opportunity to take those problems where in something like weightlifting or boxing and you have 7 divisions for men and 2 for women, and they will have a potential to be able to even those up. And it is a jigsaw puzzle because you have to sit that with this recommendation 11, which is the blatant one for women, where they're going to have a goal of 50% participation for women across the Games. Now remember, that's going to cause some issues because we have synchronised swimming, where no men, and believe there are some who would like to compete, but no men compete in synchronised swimming or rhythmic gymnastics. But that's part of the jigsaw. Recommendation 27 is the next time, if you look hard enough, you'll find some issue relating to women, which is that there is a commitment to complying with the basic principles of good governance, and that is the basic universal principles of good governance of the Olympic and sports movement. And within that, it mandates that women or that members are represented, so that where there are memberships of sporting organisations, women will need to be on those boards to be representative of those members. But remember, we've had targets of 20% representation on all of those boards since 2000. Recommendation 38 does help as well, because it recommends that the Nominations Commission, which deals with the nominations for sitting on the IOC, will deal with a criteria that will look at some gender balance. These goals will pose challenges, as you can just imagine. They are commendable, but I argue that they still don't go far enough as far as women are concerned. Taking from those reports that I referred to before, there are a number of recommendations that I argue the IOC should take in relation to women. Firstly, equal representation for men and women should be mandated on the IOC. There will be significant governance reforms required, and of course you have unlimited tenures on the IOC, so those appointed before 1999 will be there till they're 80, and those who were appointed after 1999 till they're 70. And one of the difficulties with changing a governance structure like this is that the IOC governance structure can only be changed by the IOC voting on it. So the men who sit on it, who have by far the significant majority, they have to vote to change and vote themselves out. It poses a problem. The equal opportunity for men and women to compete for medals at an event-based Olympic Games as recommended by Agenda 2020 should be prioritised. That will need careful consideration for the equal opportunity for men and women to win medals with comparable events for men and women's divisions where appropriate. You know, in the canoeing, women still cannot compete in canoeing at the Olympics. They've one event and it's kayak. So those things do need to change. Then, heeding previous recommendations, the IOC should exclude those sports and countries who do not comply with a mandated requirement of equal representation on boards. The exclusion of an individual from the international federations or the national organising committees who are non-compliant from positions on the IOC or the commissions, and the exclusion of consideration of country for hosting the Olympic Games should serve as incentive. Fourth, the development of specific education programs regarding the elevation of women in governance for the sports and for the NOCs. And lastly, Olympic Solidarity, who provide funding programs via the Olympic movement, should incentivise entitlement to funding based on the number of board members who are women and the development of programs to develop capable female athletes and board members. It's clearly discriminatory, and it offends the United Nations Convention to not permit women to play and train for sport, to fail to facilitate their participation at the Olympic Games, and to not afford these women the same opportunities as men in every respect. To fail to promote women in sport fails the Olympic Charter. The tension between encouraging participation and excluding a country that does not facilitate the fair opportunity for women in sport poses a conundrum for the IOC. To date, measures taken have not been successful in preventing ongoing human rights violations. The influence of the Olympic movement does not yet extend far enough, and it has not yet itself achieved satisfactory standards for women to provide that influence. That can only occur when the IOC has implemented equality in all of its governance and in the Olympic Games. Thank you.